Hey everybody, welcome back to Life Under Deborah's Palm, the God Stuff, where today we're going to continue the series of Who is Jesus by looking at Jesus as a high priest. If you get something out of this channel, of course, like, subscribe, share, hit that notification bell so you get updates. I am getting on the 1 week schedule. Hopefully I will stay there. In order to understand the priesthood, or Jesus as high priest, I should say, we have to understand the Levitical priesthood, which of course is found in the Old Testament. I'm going to start way back before God even established Israel, before there were 12 tribes, before there was a priesthood. We're going to take a look at this dude named Melchizedek. Melchizedek was around in the time of Abraham, before he was Abraham. First he was Abram, then God changed his name to Abraham. Melchizedek has a very short, maybe one paragraph in the Old Testament that talks about him. He shows up to Abram, not yet Abraham. Abram's nephew Lot had gone and gotten himself in trouble, and Abram went to rescue him and defeated the kings and took their plunder. When a guy named Melchizedek shows up, this is, I'm going to read this out of Genesis chapter 14, verse 16 through 20. It says, "Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was a priest of God Most High, and he blessed Abram, saying, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand. Then Abram gave him a tenth of everything." That's it. That's the whole story of Melchizedek. I remember reading this and thinking, where did that dude come from? Like, where was Salem? Presumably Jerusalem, but all of a sudden, this guy shows up. Notice, he's two things. He's a king, he's the king of Salem, and he's a priest, okay? The reason that's important is because King David in Psalm 110 prophesies about Jesus, and he says that he will come as a priest in the order of Melchizedek. I'm going to flip to Hebrews. Now Hebrews, like the end of Hebrews 4 through about maybe 8 or 9, is all about the high priesthood, and definitely you should read that. I will have all those scripture references on my blog, and it will be linked below. So you can go over there, because you know I'm going to tell you, you go read this for yourself and you read more than just the scripture references that I give you. But this is Hebrews 7, and I'm only going to read just a little bit of it. And the writer of Hebrews said about Melchizedek, he said, "This Melchizedek was king of Salem and priest of God Most High," king and priest. "He met Abraham returning from the defeat of the kings and blessed him, and Abraham gave him a tenth of everything. First, his name means king of righteousness, then also king of Salem means king of peace. Without father or mother, without genealogy, without beginning of days or end of life, like the Son of God, he remains a priest forever." Think of how great he was. Even the patriarch Abraham gave him a tenth of his plunder. Now the law requires that the descendants of Levi who become priests are to collect a tenth from the people, that is, their brothers, even though their brothers are descendants from Abraham. This man, however, did not trace his descent from Levi, yet he collected a tenth from Abraham and blessed him who had the promise. And I'm going to jump down. That was 7, 1 through 6, I believe. And I am going to jump down to 11, where it says, "If perfection could have been attained through the Levitical priesthood, why was there still a need for another priest to come, one in the order of Melchizedek, not in the order of Aaron. We haven't got to Aaron yet. For when there is a change of priesthood, there must also be a change of law. The important thing to pick out in this is that Melchizedek he existed before any priest, before God set the priests up, and he was a king and a priest. Now we're going to take a look at what is called the Levitical priesthood. Israel had 12 tribes. They eventually came along, and in the 12 tribes, the tribe of Levi was chosen by God to be the tribe that were the priests and took care of the temple, and before that, a movable tabernacle. Anyone who was a priest had to be a Levite, but not all Levites were priests. There were other things that were done in the temple that were taken care of by the Levites. First, let's take a look at the priestly garments. They are discussed in Exodus 28. The very first high priest was Aaron, who was Moses' brother. And God gave Moses instruction on how to install Aaron. And one of the things that was important was the garments that they wore. And there was an ordinary priest and a high priest. And there's only one high priest. Everybody else is an ordinary priest. So the priests wore pants, which were basically underwear. They were kind of like long shorts. They wore shorts, pants. They wore a tunic, a sash or a belt, and they wore a hat, turban-y type thing. All of their clothing was woven. It was not to be sewn. It was to be woven on a loom. Those instructions were very specific. They were not ordinary, okay? Priests were not to be ordinary. The high priest, they had added some other things. They wore a robe. Over the robe, they wore something called an ephod, which was an apron. And on the apron, they had what was called the breastplate. The breastplate was square, and on it had 12 different stones. Each one of those stones had the name of a tribe of Israel. And on top of that, I forgot to mention this, but the ephod kind of came to the top, and they had 2 stones, black stones. I think they were onyx, and 6 of the tribes were inscribed on one stone and 6 on the other. On top of that, they had something called the Uman and Thummim, and that was something that only the high priest carried, and it was a way they made decisions with God. Their turban had a gold band on the bottom of it, and the high priests were the only ones that had that. Sometimes they call it a crown, but it doesn't look like a crown like we would think of. Why was this important? Glad you asked. Let's hop over to the crucifixion. Jesus has come. He's now been crucified, and as I discussed in my last video, I said the high priest, when he slaughtered the last lamb at Passover, said, "It is finished." Jesus, as the high priest, also declared, "It is finished," at the time of his death, at which point he gave up his spirit and he died. Now, below him at the cross were guards, and the guards were casting lots to see what clothes they were going to take. They had all of Jesus' clothes, and they were doing something called casting lots, which often gets confused. People think it's gambling, because we say dice because we don't have anything like a lot in our culture. But they didn't gamble with lots. Lots were used for making decisions before the Lord, and they knew when they cast them, or kind of like rolling dice, they threw them, that there would be a decision from God that they interpreted on however those lots landed. I have no idea what they look like or what they were, and I'm not sure it's really around. I kind of tried to look it up and couldn't find what I was looking for. But it's not crapshoots. They're not like, hey, lucky number 7 gets me the robe. That's not what was going on. The part about the lots is in John 19:23-24, and it says, "When the soldiers crucified Jesus, they took his clothes, dividing them into 4 shares, one for each of them, with the undergarments remaining. The garment was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. Let's not tear it, they said to one another. Let's decide by lot who will get it. Now, this doesn't necessarily make him a high priest. All priests had woven undergarments, but notice he was not wearing ordinary stitched clothing. That's really important to know. We're going to go back to the Old Testament for a few minutes, and we're going to discuss the high priest and what his role was in the temple. Okay, he oversaw the rest of the priests, but he had a really important job once a year. In the temple, there was an outer court and inner court, a holy place, and the Holy of Holies. The Holy of Holies was where the Ark of the Covenant sat. Like if y'all ever watched Indiana Jones, the original, and he was looking for the Ark was basically a box that had these two angels that faced each other. In between those angels is where the Lord dwelt. God sat there. It was called the mercy seat. The Holy of Holies was surrounded by 30-foot curtains all the way around. No one was allowed to look in. No one was allowed to go in except the high priest. He went once a year on something called the Day of Atonement, also known as Yom Kippur. Now in Judaism, Yom Kippur is considered the most holy day. In the Old Testament, when there was a temple in Jerusalem, the high priest would not wear all his clothes, all those fancy clothes. He only wore the pants and the belt and the pants, the belt, the turban, and I believe the robe were the only things he was allowed in to the Holy of Holies with. And he was making atonement for the sins of the people of Israel. That was his job that day. But he would go into the temple and approach God. And it was one day, one man for all. When Jesus died, after he said, it is finished, and he died, it says that the temple curtain tore in two. And I'm going to read that to you in Matthew 27, and it says, "And when Jesus' spirit had cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom." Now, it was Passover, which is about 6 months before the Day of Atonement, but Jesus was making a point here. As high priest, he ripped that 30-foot curtain in half. His death caused that curtain to split. He was high priest, ripped the temple curtain, and everyone now has access, including the Gentiles. Isaiah 9 is a great foretelling of Jesus, and in it, it says the Gentiles have seen a great light. That the light is coming to those of us who aren't Jewish, who never would have had that opportunity. The Old Testament high priest's job was to run the temple because God was the center of their culture. They didn't have kings. There was a period of time where God, he was their king. They came out of Egypt. God was their king. Moses was their go-between. And after that, they came through a period where they had judges. The judges were under the headship of God. He was their king. There came a point in time where the people said, we want to be like everybody else. We want to have a king over us. And God warned them, and I believe it was Samuel that he told that day is coming, and when it comes, this is what the priests are to do. They are to write the law down, and they are to give it to the king. And the king is to read those laws, and he is to run the people and run the nation by those laws. So what we have were the priest was as much a religious ruler and a bit of a civil ruler. There's a combination of government in that there's a government that exists within the temple, and there's a government that exists within the world. And that's true in any church. Any church that we know of has a type of government. Somebody runs it. There's, people who pay the bills and people who preach and teach and whatever. That's how that worked in that day as well. So I make that point because I'm going to read you Isaiah 9, which you should go read all of Isaiah. And this is the foretelling of Jesus, and this is 6 and 7. It says, "For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this." And make a quick point before I start this. It says he will reign on the throne of David, and there is no king in Israel. That's not how Israel works. But it's a spiritual reigning. If you go to the first chapter of Matthew, the genealogy will go from David to Joseph and then Jesus. And the scriptures say from the stump of Jesse, this will arise and will happen. Jesse was David's father, and important to note, like Melchizedek, who existed before there were Levites, and he couldn't have been a Levite. They didn't exist. David was not from the tribe of Levi. He was from the tribe of Judah. Jesus was also from the tribe of Judah. He was not from Levi. He's a bit like Melchizedek, who was a forerunner and a type of Jesus, quote unquote. Okay, it's like a metaphorical, symbolic thing. Back to the government part. Did you hear me read that the greatness of the government will rest on his shoulders? This has been kind of one of those passages that's been a stumbling block for a lot of people, particularly Jewish people, because they expected an earthly king. And what they got was Jesus, and they don't accept that. So Jesus has come the first time, and he's establishing basically church government as opposed to how it was running with Levitical priesthood. He's establishing a new type of structure. That structure, instead of having priests and animal sacrifices and all of those things, now are going to be established with apostles, prophets, teachers, pastors, and evangelists. Those 5 things are the foundation of the church when it works correctly, and right now it's kind of working to that. We are used to priests or pastors, and that's not exactly how this is supposed to work, but it's getting there. But that's the government that Jesus came to establish, and that's what existed in the early church right after Jesus left. That's what got established and went forward. Now, that's government. There's a second government. Remember, Melchizedek was a priest and a king. Jesus will return as king, as in governmental king, like, kings and presidents and whatever else, parliaments and all those things. That's what the second coming is. The second time he returns, he's going to have that government, and yet he's going to rule both as a priest and a king in the order of Melchizedek. The last thing I'm going to say, it comes out of Hebrews, and it comes out of Hebrews 4:14, and this goes through 5:10, and it's actually titled Jesus the Great High Priest. I'm not going to read it all. Y'all need to go read it. Go get your scripture references from my blog, please and thank you. But it says, "Therefore, since you have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are. Yet he did not sin. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need." So I am going to say to you, have confidence. Approach the throne of grace. It's no longer the mercy seat behind the curtain that's only accessible to one. Approach that throne of grace with confidence that God doesn't hate you. He loves you. You might not do smart things, but he loves you anyways. We're all a little crazy. And if you have never done that, that's totally okay. It's really what's in your heart. God knows your heart. I have heard more stories of people who have prayed prayers going, I don't even know if you're real, but if you are, I have got a mess. And so if that's you, that's totally okay. Approach the throne of grace with confidence because mercy and grace await you. Hope that helped you out, made you see things a little bit different. Thanks for watching. Have a blessed day.